Happy Sabbath to everybody. Lovely day outside, and really privileged to speak to you today. Tomorrow is St. Patrick's Day, which we obviously don't do, but it's actually that really comes from paganism. I'm going to go into that today. And Patrick is not what people think, the Catholic saint that people think he was. In fact, he might have been a Sabbath keeper, so maybe we'll cover that some other time. But anyway, get into what I want to talk about today. Of course, we are about almost a month away from Passover. I guess we'll get there next weekend, which will be the time of Purim, by the way. I've mentioned this to you before. Purim is always about a month before Passover. It's exactly a month before Passover, the 14th of the previous month. And so a good time to read up on the book of Esther, but also to be thinking ahead to the upcoming Passover. And as we think about the Passover, we think about Jesus Christ and his amazing sacrifice, what he did for us, who he was. You know, that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. This being that was with the Father from eternity. We read in John 1, verses 1 through 3, that in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, and all things were made through him. Without him, nothing was made that was made. He was the one through whom the Father created the universe, and as it says in verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory as the only begotten of the Father. And there are many indications that tell us that Jesus Christ actually existed as God along with the Father. In fact, at the end of his life, in John 17, he prayed in verse 5 there, and now, Father, glorify me together with you with the glory I had with you before the world was. So he existed there with the Father before the world existed as God with him. And we're also told in, John 8, verse 58, they were challenging Jesus, and they said, well, because he had said, well, Abraham rejoiced to see my day. They said, well, you're not 50 years old. Have you seen Abraham? He said, assuredly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. He said, I am, which, of course, is referring back to what God told Moses at the burning bush. I am who I am, and tell your people I am has sent you. And I'll have us look at something there a little bit later. But actually, one thing I want to go to actually is in Acts 3, because this is something that people will use to try to deny that. And I bring this up because it's going around again. I see this occasionally. People are making a big case for trying to argue that the one who became Jesus Christ was not God in the Old Testament. And of course, we think about who was the God in the Old Testament. And I want us to look here at Acts chapter 3 and read here about the fact that Jesus had died, and it says in verse 13, let's look at that. It says, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, glorified his servant Jesus, whom you delivered up and denied in the presence of Pilate when he was determined to let him go. So the idea here is that, the argument is that, look, the God of the patriarchs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the one who glorified Jesus, and so that means Jesus was not the God of the patriarchs. And I want to also note another verse along this line, which is in Acts 5. If you look over here in verse 30, it actually says that the God of our fathers raised up Jesus, whom you murdered by hanging on a tree. And so the idea is that, well, the God of the fathers was exclusively God the Father, and not the one who became Yeshua, Jesus Christ. That is not, that he was not part of that God of the Old Testament. But actually, that's not what this is saying. And I want to make that very clear that that's not what this is saying. So my question is, who was the God of the patriarchs? Who was the God of the patriarchs? One thing I would like you to note is, the verses I've cited to you already. I mean, there's, the fact that John 1:1, it says through 3 there says that God created all things through Jesus Christ, and the fact that Jesus in John 8:58 said, before Abraham was, I am. Of course, we also have, I'll just reference for you 1 Corinthians 10, verse 4, which mentions that rock that accompanied the Israelites in the wilderness, and that rock was Christ. And the rock was a name for the God of Israel, and that rock was Christ. So he was there with them. They knew him, and of course, we're also told by, that when Jesus came, he came to reveal the Father. He says that in a few places, that people did not know the Father and that he came to reveal him. But I want you to turn back to Exodus chapter 3 and notice something here where Moses encountered God at the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. And we're told here that that God actually, encountered him, but we're specifically told that that it says in verse 2, it says, the angel of the Lord. Angel is the Hebrew malach, and it means a messenger. Now, we've talked about this before, that a messenger is, it could be a lesser spirit being, that God has other angels, that he sends. But this one in, probably if you here have a New King James, the A is capitalized because it's talking about, capital A is not just a typical angel. It's someone else, because it says, and the angel of the Lord, the messenger of the Lord, appeared to him, to Moses, in a flame of fire from the midst of the bush. So he looked, and Moses says, I'll turn aside. And it says in verse 4, and when the Lord, the eternal Yahweh, saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. He said, here I am. And he said, in verse 6, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look on him. So this being, who was the angel of the Lord, as it says, the messenger of the Lord, actually says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, some people argue, well, he was just speaking for God. Not that he was God. And that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I've got a book called Who Ate Lunch with Abraham by Messianic author Asher Intrater, dated 2011. And I'll quote from this book. It says, there are many angels, and they often appear to the sons of men. Yet there is another figure called the angel of Yahweh. He is different. He speaks as God in the first person. And he is called by the name Yahweh, or Jehovah here, in the passage as well. In this passage as well, talking about Genesis 16, to Hagar. The angel of Yahweh speaks to her, Hagar, as if he were God, and is called by the name of Jehovah or Yahweh. This same angel also appeared to Abraham at the time of the sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22. This was no ordinary angel. The angel then begins to speak to him as God in the first person. It would not be reasonable for a normal angel to speak this way in the first person in referring to himself as God. So, you don't have that unless it is God. And why is it God? Because both the Father and the Word who became Jesus Christ were God. The Word was the messenger for God. And so in that sense, the angel of Yahweh, we understand, was this one who is a messenger. And that's very important to grasp. And in fact, we see this in a couple other places. So turn over to Genesis chapter 31. Now remember, God had appeared to Jacob at Bethel when he first fled from Esau, and he went to the land of his family where they were from, up in Mesopotamia. And while he was there, God is telling him it's time to come back home. And so in verse 11 of Genesis 31, it says, and the angel of God spoke to me in a dream, saying, Jacob. And I said, here I am. He says, lift your eyes, and etc. Verse 13, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar, and where you made a vow to me. Who did he make a vow to? It wasn't just some angel. It was to God. And this one who is saying, I am the God of Bethel, is this angel or messenger that is speaking to him. So this messenger who's speaking to him is, as we understand, brethren, is the one who became Jesus Christ. And in something else that really magnifies this, I'd like you to turn over to Genesis chapter 48, which is where Jacob put a blessing on Ephraim and Manasseh. So here's the question again. Who was the God of the patriarchs? Was it exclusively the Father, is what we're talking about. And I want to show you that right there, the one that Jacob had made a vow to was the angel, the messenger, right? As he actually said that. It's actually very clear there. And here it's even more clear, because in this case that I'm going to show you now, somebody might argue about the other one. Well, in the other case, this angel was just bearing the words of God the Father, and therefore it was still with God the Father, which it was, by the way. I don't want to deny that God the Father was actually also their God. I mean, they believed in one who was an angel for another, and I want to make that clear. And if we look here in Genesis 48, though, we're going to see who Jacob identified as his God in this sense. And so Jacob says, this is verse 15, and he blessed Joseph and said, God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has led me all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil. Notice that, the messenger who has redeemed me from all evil is the God who has led me all my life long to this day. Bless the lads, let my name be named on them. So he's very clearly saying that his God is the messenger of God. Now let's think about that for a second. Who was their God? Well, was it just this angel? That doesn't actually make sense either. This angel, the word angel itself means messenger. Messenger is one who's bearing a message from another, right? So in that sense, there were two beings who were their God. There was this angel or messenger, and the one that he was the messenger for, which would be the Father in that sense. And we see that also in the case of Abraham in Genesis 14 with Melchizedek. Remember, Melchizedek, if we look in Hebrews 7, the king of righteousness without beginning of days or end of life, that Melchizedek, we understand, was a manifestation of the Lord who became Jesus Christ, there before Abraham. And that person was, as we're told, the priest of God Most High, which means he was an intercessor between another who is, God the Father and mankind. So who was Abraham's God? Well, that Melchizedek said, blessed be Abram of God Most High, and he was a priest. So clearly, Abraham's God was both the Father and the messenger, who was the Word, who became Jesus Christ. So we put these things together, and that makes a great deal of sense, and it paints an amazing picture. Now, when we get to those statements in the New Testament, where it says that the God of our fathers raised up Jesus, or the God of our fathers glorified Jesus, does that mean Jesus was not part of their God before that? No, it doesn't mean that at all. Basically, what we had is the God of the patriarchs was two beings, the Father and the Word who became Christ. But then, when the Word became flesh, the one who was acting throughout the universe as God was only one of them. It was the Father. Jesus was on the earth doing the work that he was given to do on the earth. And then when he died, he was completely not doing anything. He was dead. And the one who was the Father was exclusively acting. So the God of their fathers then raised up Jesus. It wasn't a different God. It was the same God. It was just their God was those two beings, one of whom was at that point dead, and then the one who was alive is the one who raised him back to life. And that's the way we understand that. And it actually makes a great deal of sense if we put it together that way. The statement in Acts 3 and 5 was not really meant to parse out the nature of God and the idea of whether Christ was himself God. And in fact, Christ was already acknowledged by God, if you remember, by Thomas when he said to him, "My Lord and my God," when he acknowledged who he was. But that wasn't probably fully still understood until much later about the role that Jesus Christ had played throughout the Old Testament. That probably came over time in the New Testament. But it doesn't make the statement in Acts 3 and Acts 5 wrong. It was a perfectly fine statement, and it was true. It just didn't give the full, complete revelation about the nature of God. But when we understand all these scriptures together, we get the full picture. Who was the God of the Old Testament? The God of the Old Testament was the same as our God, which is God the Father and the Word who became Jesus Christ. Two beings who are both God. And that is a wonderful truth that we need to hold on to dearly.